Welcome to CFTC Talks. I'm your host, Andy Bush. Remember, there's an important disclaimer at the end of the show you should listen to. This week, we get to a topic that no one before last November thought would ever happen, but everyone will be impacted by it, and that is tax reform. Now, whether it's your own personal taxes or the taxes the company you work for pays or the economy, tax reform will impact almost every sector out there, from a whole range of companies, from technology to even restaurants. It's a little scary, right? It's kind of perfect for the month of October with Halloween. You get it right, good things are going to happen. You get it wrong, well, you know the answer. And to get answers, we turn to someone who has been knee-deep in this ever since he was a small boy growing up near the steel mills in Pittsburgh. Today, we bring on Douglas Holtz-Eakin. He is the president of the American Action Forum, a 501c3 organization. Now, Doug went to Denison University. He got his PhD in economics from Princeton. He taught at Syracuse, worked in the Council of Economic Advisors under Bush 41, and was the chief economist at the same place, the CEA, under Bush 43, then became the director of the Congressional Budget Office under Bush 43, which, by the way, provides budgetary and policy analysis to Congress. And now, of course, is the president of the American Action Forum. Doug, gosh, it's so great to have you on. Welcome to CFTC Talks.
Well, I'm happy to be on. Thank you.
Before we dive into what's happening on tax reform, I wanted to ask you about your time as chief economist for the President's Council of Economic Advisors, or the CEA, during the aftermath of 9/11. How did that time shape your views and how you look at government?
Well, certainly it was a traumatic and dramatic period, beginning with fleeing from the Eisenhower Executive Office building on September 11th, 2001. The Secret Service ran through the halls, and they were yelling, "There's a plane coming, run." And that was the evacuation plan.
Wow.
From that moment forward, I remembered nothing but nonstop work for months in an environment that, to say the least, was highly pressurized. There was a helicopter circling the White House complex 24/7. You always heard it. There were extraordinary measures taken to ensure security of the complex, and the security reflected that. So in that, a couple of things came out. Number one, the government really couldn't do everything. I can remember being sent up to visit Ground Zero shortly after September 11th to see what we could do to get the small business community back up and running again in New York City. And it turned out that as effective as FEMA was, as effective as the Small Business Administration was, you needed the private agencies on the ground, private charities, the Better Business Bureaus, the Chambers of Commerce, the entire collective business community, which could help people get help from the government. And that was an incredibly important insight to me. It wasn't enough to have these programs. People don't know how to get to the programs, use the programs, or anything like that.
Right.
So that was important. We also had to invent a lot of new things. Terrorism risk insurance to keep property and casualty insurance flowing to particularly large structures in center cities. We had to invent a lot of regulation in the interest of national security, Patriot Act, things like that. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the lessons with 2020 hindsight is we went too far. And for me, the notion that freedom, economic freedom included, is something that you should be very careful in infringing on is one of the great lessons of that era. I think we went too far with terrorism risk insurance. I think we went too far with some of the intrusiveness of the security apparatus, and the business community paid a price for it, and the economy did as well. And those are all important lessons that even in the moment you have to remember to know that nothing's absolute. You've got to balance scales. And, in economics, the right answer is rarely 0 or 100%. You're always in the middle somewhere. And that was a lesson I lost on certain days.
Well, let's turn to the present and talk about something many never thought would see the light of day, and that's tax reform. The first step in this process was the House passed a budget, then the Senate passed a budget, and this was key in moving forward on tax reform. Break it down for our audience, Doug. Why was this important?
The whole role of these budget resolutions is to provide to the Congress the ability to bypass typical Senate procedure, which is unlimited debate and a supermajority vote to end that debate, and instead have a finite amount of debate, and a simple up or down majority vote to pass a bill. That's known as reconciliation. You can only have reconciliation instructions if the House passes a budget resolution that has them in it, the Senate passes a budget resolution that has them in it, they match, and then you go. And
there's one per year, right? One per budget year.
One per year.
Okay.
In any budget resolution, you can have a reconciliation instruction for spending. So go do this to spending, and you get special protections for that. You get one for taxes. Go do this to taxes, up or down, whatever it might be. And you get one for debt. And so this is the fiscal year 2018 budget resolution we're looking at, and the key one is the tax reconciliation instruction. So far, we've got one in the House, one in the Senate. They do not yet match. One of the last steps in the Senate was to amend its budget resolution to be, A, appealing to the House, have a higher defense number and a few other things, and B, to allow it to bypass the House Budget Committee and go straight to the floor. That would speed the process. And so I expect the House to pass that budget resolution sometime this week, and then they will have passed the same one in the House and Senate, and they can get to the business of tax reform itself.
And there's something called the chairman's mark that I think may come out this week. Maybe it'll come out next week, but that'll provide some of the guts to the tax reform. It'll give us some more of the details, won't it?
The chairman's mark is the first piece of legislative language that actually says, this is what we're changing, this is what we're not, this is how fast we're changing it, how big the tax cut will be, all of the things that you've heard the public speculate about, banty about, but really not know. And so my understanding is that Chairman Brady in the Ways and Means Committee will release his chairman's mark as soon as the budget is put to rest, and so that's probably this week as well.
Wow, that's great. Well, let's talk about some of the key areas in business tax reform. There's the lowering of overall rates, there's the international component, there's pass-throughs, and there's provisions like full expensing. So let's start with the rates. It's often cited that the U.S. has the highest nominal tax rate in the OECD at 35%, but the effective rate is somewhere below that, like at 28%, still very, very high. What rates do you think the U.S. should have to make it competitive with other countries?
So when you think about the corporate rate, there are really two things that it plays into. The first is that for an existing facility in the U.S., it's part of the incentives whether you expand or not. So the marginal investment incentives are in part influenced by the corporate rate. You'll want to get it down for that reason. But where you put investment is probably the biggest impact. Do you put it in the U.S., high effective rate, or do you put it somewhere else? And so I think to get the locational incentives leveled out a little bit, we have to get the U.S. into the middle of the range, somewhere in the 20 to 25% tax rate range. And that would be an enormous step forward from where we are right now, where we're really effectively pushing investment offshore, pushing production offshore. We're parking our intellectual property offshore, and on a tax basis, providing disincentives to be in the United States, whether you're U.S. headquartered or someone from abroad, it doesn't matter. You want the investment dollars flowing into the U.S., financing investment and productivity growth here.
Yeah, the U.S., getting to the international component of this, and I think this is really important, but the U.S. is one of the only countries that attempts to tax business activities outside of the U.S. by taxing a U.S. company that earns profits overseas and then has to bring them back at 35%. And this has led to a massive amount of unreturned profits, and this is estimated to be somewhere around $2.5 trillion or so. Is that going to change in tax reform, do you think?
Yeah, the U.S. is the last developed country holding on to a so-called worldwide system. All of our major competitors have switched to territorial systems, taxing firms on the basis of what they earn in that territory, so what they'd earn in the U.S. domestic market. The most recent to switch were the United Kingdom and Japan, and that was very recent. So, all the evidence is that we are running in a very dangerous experiment, which is to say, continuing with the worldwide system, providing our firms with an incentive to be abroad, earn the money abroad, and then leave it abroad. Right. And worse, whenever there's a merger or acquisition that crosses borders, anyone who does the math says, gee, we don't want to be in the U.S., and so we're really at a tax disadvantage in almost every way. So that's part of the reason why tax reform is so important. The status quo is literally dangerous to America. We have a poor set of incentives, and we're losing the investments and the headquarters and all sorts of things.
So, ladies and gentlemen, when Doug says that, he's talking about U.S. companies moving out, and that's reducing or eroding the base of companies that we can tax or that are in the United States, and that's not a good thing. And by the way, I have a sneaking suspicion then that from what I've seen on the repatriated tax thing, it so far from what I saw, and I wrote about some of this when I was in the private sector, but that I've seen like a one-time tax at either 10 to 15%. And then have it go away. So that one-time tax is a big deal because that's a major pay for the other lowering of rates.
Yeah, the way this will work is very different from past, quote, repatriation holidays, where you'd cut the rate and ask firms, would you like to bring it back? In this context, what they will do is they will say, on a date certain, they'll write it into the law, we will have deemed every dollar being held abroad to have come back to the U.S. and be subject to a tax, 10%, whatever it might be.
Right.
Then comes the really interesting part, in my view. If the rest of the tax reform is done right, that money will come back because this will, in fact, be the best place to invest your money on the globe.
Mm-hmm.
If the rest of the tax reform is not done well, firms could pay that tax one time and leave it abroad, invest elsewhere. It's a built-in test for whether we do this right, and I think it's very important that we do it right.
You know, I hadn't thought about that. That is a great point to make, because I always thought that they for sure would bring it back just under the risk that that this may change down the road, that you want to bring that back, get taxed at a certain amount, and then let it go. But you also need an incentive to have it brought back. And under that guise of that thought of bringing it back and doing it right and giving companies an incentive, let's talk about full expensing, because as a budget guy, you know that this provides the biggest economic impact according to groups like the Tax Foundation.
Yeah, full expensing is simple. It says that in the year you make an investment, you get to deduct the full cost of that investment. The nice thing about it from the point of view of the tax policy is it guarantees you that you will get full cost recovery because you get it right away.
Right.
And you get it right away for tangible and intangible investments. You get it right away for short-term and long-term investments. So the length of the investment doesn't matter. The character of the investment doesn't matter. You're leveling the tax playing field and letting capital markets allocate capital instead of having the tax code do it. That's its great attraction from the point of view of tax policy people. It also has the advantage of saying, hey, if you grow your business, you're going to have lower taxes because you can take all this expensing. And so the growth incentives are quite powerful. It's the best thing you can use for the sort of small firms, the startup firms, the firms that you're really going to create the most new employment in the economy.
That's a great point. So maybe put your entrepreneurial hat on for just a second, because I know I think you taught a class on that, didn't you, in Syracuse?
I did, yes.
Yeah,
I wrote a couple of papers on it, you know. I actually used to do things.
Yeah. Once upon a time, before your time in government. Yes, indeed. Of all of these things, right? Like, and maybe before I get to this question, let me step back. Let me ask you about pass-throughs, because a lot of small businesses are pass-throughs.
Yes.
Well, what's going on here in this space of tax reform? I mean, after 1980s, the creation of these pass-throughs, these things really expanded greatly because they had a tax benefit to them. So walk our audience through why addressing this is so important.
More than one half of all business income is reported on and taxed on individual income tax returns in the form of, partnerships, sole proprietorships, S corps, things like that, limited liability corporations. All of those pass-through entities are important vehicles for doing business now. So if you change the rules for the C corporations, the corporate rate, you move to a territorial system, you give them an investment incentives like expensing, you really ought to do comparable things on the pass-through side so that the business tax playing field is level. And that's what they're attempting to do in this framework. They're going to have a special rate at which those pass-through entities' business income will be taxed, and they will get the same tax base as do the big corporations. So you get the investment incentives, you get the incentives to do it in the U.S., you get a lower rate. It's an attempt to level that playing field in a very important way. It raises some issues because anybody who would love to change their wage income, which is going to be taxed at, say, 35%, into business income, which gets taxed at 25%, and there would be ways to do that. So they're going to have to come up with some rules to prevent abuse, and you'll hear a lot of commentary about that, but I still think it's worth the attempt, however imperfect, to try to take care of the smaller business community at the same time.
All right, with that in mind, going back to your 1990s efforts, of all this stuff, right, all the things that are going on with tax reform, what would benefit entrepreneurs the most and drive the most job creation?
So for most of these calculations, the answer is it doesn't really matter. You've got some treatment of interest expense, you've got expensing, you've got rate, you put them all together into a cost of capital, and the whole goal is to get the cost of capital down.
Right.
For the entrepreneurial community, cash flow matters. And the ability to expense investment, for example, means you aren't writing a tax check. It means you could put that check into your payroll, you can put it into your investment, and that cash flow is an enormous help for the survival and expansion of entrepreneurial enterprises. It's one of the great lessons of that literature.
Yeah, interesting. Well, I guess that just circles back to the full expensing. Obviously, that's really important. All right, I want to get to something that you did write more recently, back, not the 1990s, but you wrote an op-ed in The Hill with the title, America Needs Tax Reform Now. And the very first line you state that poor economic growth is the top problem facing policymakers. Yet the pushback on this, Doug, as you know, is the economy is growing this year, somewhere around 2.5%. Unemployment's at 4.3%. And the argument against it is, why do you think the economy needs help now? And how is tax reform the answer?
Well, about 2 months ago, the census put out its annual report on median household income in the United States, and there was a lot of attention paid to the fact that real median household income went up 3.2% in 2016. A lot of patting on the back and self-congratulation. If you look inside that report to people who worked full-time, full year, their real increase was zero.
Wow.
That's the problem. We got some more income because some people who weren't working at all started to work. Someone from part-time to full-time. Those are all good things. I don't want to dispute that.
Right.
But we've had people who've had their job even through the crisis. They still have their job. They still haven't gotten a raise. We're almost 10 years out.
Wow.
That's unacceptable. And so if you look at that phenomenon and ask what's going on, well, number one, productivity growth is low. We can't give people real wage increases with bad productivity growth. So let's go to the things that can affect productivity growth, which include tangible and intangible investments. They include the R&D, and they really count on doing it here. Tax policy can help a lot. Improve the allocation of capital, increase the level of capital, raise productivity. It doesn't do everything. It's not a panacea, but if you've got a growth problem and you're already at full employment, all you can do is make those workers more productive. So that's where we're aiming with this tax reform. And
it's really about incentives. Like we talk about the cost of capital, and some people's eyes may glaze over a little bit. But
really? Oh my God!
I'm great for stating the obvious. But I think it's so important for people to understand this because it really impacts their lives. Like the structure of what we have right now is, as a University of Chicago guy, really inefficient. It doesn't do what we want it to do. We want it to be smooth. We want to take away the friction that's out there, the stuff that slows down job growth, slows down the economy, and getting back to reform. I mean, it's been 30 years. It's about time to look back and see all of the mess that has been larded onto our tax code and do something about it.
If you're looking to make a business decision on the basis of a tax consideration, two bad things are happening. Number one, you're not doing it on the basis of the business model or market conditions or financing or any real economic fundamental. And number two, instead of paying somebody to cure cancer, we're paying them to figure out this tax problem. So we're wasting an enormous amount in our economy. Tax reform is all about getting rid of that waste, using our talents, our capital as efficiently as possible. And for that reason, for the middle class, the folks who are out there who didn't get a raise, the most important thing in tax reform are the incentives, not the kinds of things you actually read about in the paper. Oh, the brackets are going to be 12, 25, 35, standard deductions can be bigger. That's all important. It's fine. But it pales in comparison to having an economy that's growing, say, at 2.5 or 2.7 percentage points a year instead of 2. That difference is huge, and it goes on forever. That's the kind of improvement you want.
Well, to that point, and before I let you go, I want to ask one last question. on the budget, right? Saving the worst for last, Doug.
Yes.
But I have to ask you, because this is where you lived for a good long time. How is it going to be impacted, and really will it matter? Because I think if I remember correctly reading, there's within both the House and the Senate, they've got a component on taxes that can increase the budget deficit to the tune of about $1.5 trillion.
Right. So the final budget resolution will in fact contain a reconciliation instruction, the famous special procedure, and it'll say to the Ways and Means Committee and the Finance Committee, go do something with taxes, and you can lose up to $1.5 trillion over the next 10 years. So that's a budget deficit of about $150 billion a year, and we're already over $600 billion.
Right.
I don't think, in and of itself, anyone should find that an appealing prospect. I certainly do not. We have big fiscal problems that need to be addressed, and they are really the subject of entitlement reform. But I think as a realistic matter of political economy, we're not going to do major Medicare reform, Social Security reform, Medicaid reform in an economy that's not growing well. People will be afraid. That's the only thing they have at the moment. So let's get the growth. And so if $1.5 trillion in additional deficits is the price of real good tax reform that gets us growth, that's a price worth paying. And so I think everyone should, hold in abeyance their concerns over the deficit and look at the actual legislation, see what we're getting for our money. That's the key.
All right, American Action Forum President Douglas Holtz-Eakin, thanks for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
All right. That's all from me this week. If you want to listen to more podcasts, you can go to our website at cftc.gov and click on the podcast button. Or you can go to your podcast button on your phone, type in CFTC Talks, and click subscribe to get them every week. We cover everything we watch at the agency, and we do interviews with weather experts, to chairs of the powerful House and Senate Ag Committees, to economists, to people that are going to give us insights and ideas about the markets we watch. If you have time, check them out. All right, we'll be back next week with another guest on our quest to learn about the markets we watch. I'm Andy Bush. Thanks for listening. But wait, there's more. Disclaimer time! The CFTC is providing this information as a public service and is neither a legal interpretation nor a statement of CFTC policy. Reference to any specific product, service, trademark, manufacturer, or service provider does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by the CFTC. The CFTC is not liable to any consumer or third party for any direct, indirect, incidental, consequential, special, or exemplary damages or lost profit related to the use of the information provided or referenced in the podcast. Selection of guests on the podcast does not imply an endorsement of any particular individual or entity. Many individuals and entities provided similar services to those of the guests. The views and opinions expressed by the guest in the podcast are their own and not specifically endorsed by the CFTC. Moreover, the information provided in this podcast should not be construed as investment advice. Consumers should rely on their own inquiries as to the accuracy and relevance of the information incorporated and referenced in this podcast and assume the entire risk related to its use. The CFTC is providing this interpretation of market trends solely to inform the public of a framework for projecting future outcomes under different scenarios. If you have any questions concerning the meaning or application of a particular law or rule administered by the CFTC, please consult with an attorney.